All right, I got 9 o'clock, and the clock on the wall's got a minute after, so I guess we best get started. Nehemiah chapter 5, where we'll start this morning. Nehemiah chapter 5. Good to see everybody this morning. Is there any announcements we need to make? Happy 4th of July, but any announcements we need to make? No, Vinny. Jay will catch us up on the announcements in the announcement time. But hope that you've had a good weekend and that you have a good beginning of the week. Celebrate the 4th safely, calmly. Good luck. But enjoy it. Nehemiah chapter 5. Nehemiah finds out about Jerusalem. Walls are down. Gets an okay from the king to go back. And so Nehemiah goes back, surveys for a period of time, walls, tells the people what he sees, tells them what they need to know with regards to a plan that he has to rebuild the walls. The people say, it's a great idea. It's a great idea. We then run into some trouble. There are those that Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem that do not, for whatever reason, want the walls rebuilt. We gave some possibilities as why, but we don't really know. They just seemingly did not want the walls rebuilt. And so then last week we looked at sort of a unique chapter to try to study from, but there are things within it that help us. And it's just the idea that it took a great number of people to finish this task. And not only did it take a great number of people to finish the task, but the people were willing to do what they could do. And they applied their abilities, their trades to do what they could do. And so now we get into Nehemiah, the 5th chapter, and all of a sudden now we've got problems amongst the ranks. Usually, external problems in a group cause the group to get tighter. Greater unity, a greater strength, a greater bond. Why? Because all of a sudden we're together opposed to those that are on the outside. But when you all of a sudden have internal problems, what happens? It begins to push the group further and further and further apart. And so there are internal problems. Now, as we'll look at some of these things, especially we get to verse 3, we don't know exactly when this apparent famine began. It's believed that a lot of these problems did not begin in Nehemiah's time, that they began well before Nehemiah, and that all of a sudden, especially with the idea of hunger, and the folks that are rebuilding the walls, all of a sudden there is this belief that this was not all of a sudden, but this was a problem that started before Nehemiah, but now Nehemiah has to handle it. And how he handles it is most intriguing. And how he handles it from the standpoint of we look at Nehemiah, when I look at Nehemiah and I study the book of Nehemiah, I look at it from the standpoint of leadership. Being in a leadership position, I often study the book of Nehemiah from a standpoint of a leadership. What's a good leader? What does he do? How does he act? How does he control himself? How does he handle situations? But when you look at Nehemiah from, say, just a layperson's perspective, you have to say, okay, here's what Nehemiah did. And isn't it interesting how problems were handled and how people responded? It doesn't take much, though, for folks to disagree. It doesn't take much for folks to have problems, and it doesn't take much for folks to have problems internally. And it's not that you have problems internally, it's how you deal with those problems. It's how you solve those problems. It's how you come to an answer to those problems. That's how it shows up, and that's how it affects everyone. Well, let's look at this. Let's look at how Nehemiah handles the situation. In beginning in verse 1, it says, there was a great outcry of the people and their wives against the Jewish brethren. For there were those who said, we, our sons and our daughters are many, therefore let us get grain that we may eat and live. Here's the first problem. There's outcry. And think about what it says. There's a great outcry. In other words, this wasn't one or two people whispering. This is a multitude of the folks, a little upset. And who wouldn't be? Why? They're hungry. They're hungry. There's evidently, what we can gather, there's a famine in the land, but these folks need to eat. Workers need to eat. They're working on the wall, right? They're working to rebuild the walls. They're working during the day. At night, there are shifts with regards to setting up and making sure that the enemy doesn't overtake the structure. And so consequently, they're constantly at work, and they're hungry. They need to be fed. But isn't it interesting that it says an outcry of the people and their wives? I have no clue. The text does not tell us why it mentions their wives. In some ways, when it just says the people, wouldn't that include their wives? Well, certainly. Was it that the wives were more vocal than the men? Could be. Well, why were they more vocal? Well, maybe because they were at home, and they were at home with the children, and they were at home with themselves, and their minds were not consumed with, let's build the walls, finish the wall. Here we are, we're at work, we're working day by day, hour by hour, doing all that we can. They're consumed with the idea of what? Feeding the family, right? Taking care of the family. Maybe that's why they're mentioned. I don't know. We don't know. But we do know that there's an outcry from everyone. It could be, and stop and think about this, it could be with a Jewish mindset that Nehemiah, when he says the people outcried, he was just thinking about the men. But he wanted to make sure that all those of Jewish background understood it wasn't just the men that were upset, it was the women that were upset. I don't know. Scriptures don't tell us. And your guess is as good as mine. And you might say, well, preacher, your guess is wrong. Okay, that's fine. And I won't say your guess is wrong because I don't know. But those are some possibilities. But there's a great outcry. There's a great outcry. Notice what it says, against their Jewish brethren. It is, the problem is within now. It's not without, it's within. And so, here's their problem. We, our sons, our daughters are many, and we need to eat. We need to eat, though, to live. So the implication is they're not, oh, we've missed a meal, but we're starving, and we're starving to death. We need food. Complaint number 2, verse 3. There were also some who said, we've mortgaged our lands and vineyards and houses that we might buy grain because of the famine. There were those that mortgaged their houses. Biblical times, did folks borrow? Yes. And oftentimes, as these folks, when it says they mortgaged their houses, they mortgaged their lands, they borrowed against their house. They borrowed against what they owned. And so they used their house, they used their lands, if you will, as collateral, as security. And it says, we mortgaged our lands and our vineyards and our houses to buy grain. The famine that's in the land. We don't know. And as far as I have been able to ascertain through my studies for a long time on this great book, history doesn't really tell us when this famine occurred. But it's believed by most that it probably occurred before Nehemiah started the rebuild of the walls, because they're seemingly in dire straits already. And after all, think about it, the rebuilding of the wall, as we'll see in a couple of chapters, just took 52 days. So they had gotten into this a little ways. They'd already had the uprising of Geshem and Sanballat and Tobiah. And now they've gotten into it, and like I say, the men are so consumed with work. There's hunger. They've borrowed against their own properties in order to buy the grain that they need. They need more food. And then comes problem number 3, verse 4. We're fixing to open this up. Let me kind of get through the first 4 or 5 verses. There were also those who said, we've borrowed money for the king's tax on our lands and vineyards. So they've mortgaged everything to buy grain to eat. Now all of a sudden it says we've borrowed money for the king's taxes. Persia, who was in control at this time, we often sometimes refer to them as the Medo-Persian era, but they were not, they didn't believe in a small tax, let's put it like that. It was an exorbitant amount that these folks had to pay tax-wise. And it was so big for some of them that they said, well, we even had to borrow money just to pay our taxes. There's the third complaint. Fourth complaint, verse 5. Yet now our flesh is as the flesh of our brethren, our children as their children, and indeed we are forcing our sons and our daughters to be slaves, and some of our daughters have been brought into slavery. It is not in our power to redeem them, for other men have our lands and our vineyards. Okay, here's the fifth problem. The fifth problem is, he says, we're just like everybody else. We're broke. We have no money. We basically told our sons that they have to go into slavery, that they have to become indentured servants, forced laborers. And he also says, even our daughters have been sold into slavery. Even our daughters have become concubines to the rich. And so the rich have gotten richer while the Jews, the poor Jew children, if you will, they have fallen behind. And he says, we don't have the power to redeem them. Now, one of the things we're going to find out in the next couple of verses is how could they pay it back? A Jew, according to the law, do you remember? How much interest could a Jew charge a fellow Jew? 0. How much could he charge someone that was considered a Gentile? Anything he could get. That's right. A Jew could loan and could borrow money from a fellow Jew. But whatever he used for collateral, what had to happen to it? Had to be given back. And then year of Jubilee, the 50th year, the land and all went back to the original family owners. And so you could borrow, but you still had, a Jew could borrow from a Jew, but the Jew couldn't charge him interest. Now, the Jew could charge the Gentile interest, but he couldn't charge the Jew interest. And so here's their dilemma. We have gotten so broke, if you will, that we have basically talked to our sons and we've said, well, you're going to have to go into slavery. And our daughters, you're going to have to go be a concubine for some rich man. You can imagine, and I think that's probably all we can do is imagine, but you can imagine the heartache, the hurt, the feelings of despair, the feelings of discouragement. Now let's think about these 5 problems for a minute. Nehemiah has come, and Nehemiah has pointed out that the wall hasn't been rebuilt. Now, we said, when we studied it in Nehemiah chapter 2, that maybe it was because the people were just sitting there, and maybe it was because the king evidently hadn't said that it could be done. And until the king said, All right, it can be done. It had to sit there. But now all of a sudden Nehemiah comes and Nehemiah says, hey, we've got this wall that's got to be rebuilt. We've got to fortify. You know, we're sitting as open ducks, if you will. We're sitting on the pond, open ducks, open season. We got to fortify. We've got to build the wall so that we'll be all right. We'll be safe. And they say, yeah, this is what God would want. Now, contextually, think about something. Ezra, go back to the book of Ezra. Ezra and Zerubbabel being first. Zerubbabel has led folk to come back from Babylonian captivity to Jerusalem. The temple has been rebuilt. Religion, if you will, use that term, religion has been introduced again through Ezra's return. Nehemiah's rebuilding is structural, but we're doing God's work. What do you think you would feel if you were sitting as those folks in that day? Yeah. Why do we need to keep doing this? Look what's happening to us. Look what has happened to us in this time. Yet we're doing God's work. Sounds real close to church work, doesn't it, even today? We sit in our wonderfully air-conditioned church buildings, beautiful, and we trying our best as Christians to live the Christian life, build up the church by inviting people to church. And things just don't seem to go the way we think they ought to go. You get discouraged, right? Things don't go your way. Doesn't always go your way, does it? These folks have legitimate complaints. These folks have legitimate problems. And so now we move forward. And I want you to see verse 6, Nehemiah's reaction. Nehemiah has, I think, kind of an interesting yet legitimate reaction. I became very angry when I heard their outcry and these words. I became angry. Usually, when do changes occur? We change something when what? We either get mad or somebody else gets mad at us, right? Our wife tells us to do something and it doesn't fit our schedule, we're not going to do it. And then all of a sudden she hollers at us and threatens us, and then we realize it's serious and we get up and do it, right? Shake your head. Tell the truth. Shake your head. Nehemiah becomes angry. That's to the point of which he'd heard these 5 complaints from his own brethren. Is it possible this hadn't all kicked in with Nehemiah? He hadn't seen all of this? He didn't know about all of this? Possible, isn't it? Is it possible that Nehemiah knew, but he didn't know to the degree? Possible. Is it possible that he knew, but he was just going to drive that horse, if you will, as long as he could drive it until they complained? Could have been. I don't know. And I don't know because the text doesn't tell us. I would assume, because as we get to the end of this chapter, we find out Nehemiah is a man of good character. And Nehemiah probably knew, he probably just didn't know to what degree. You know, he was busy with his plan, right? Rebuild the wall. And he knew he had to rebuild the wall. He could stay there for a period of time, but he was going to, one of the agreements that he made with the king of Persia, Artaxerxes, was that he'd come back, right? So I got to get this, I got to get it done, got to get it in order, we need to finish this, doo-dah. And so Nehemiah, though, becomes angry at the situation. But not only does he become angry at the situation, but look at what happens next, verse 7. After serious thought, he became angry, and it became time to analyze the situation. Let's see the problem. He sees the problem, he understands the problem, he needs to analyze the situation, he needs to find out what's going on. And so he thought, what's the next thing? I rebuked, right? I rebuked the nobles and the rulers. Can't you appreciate that? That's a man going to battle for you, right? If you watch sports, and we'll use baseball because that's the season that we're in now. If you watch baseball, especially professional baseball, you'll note from time to time that a manager of a team will get thrown out of the game by the umpire. And the manager will always justify it by saying what? I was protecting my players. I argued with the umpire because of my players. And they threw me out of the game. Of course, they probably said a few things they probably shouldn't have said. But I was protecting my players. Nehemiah is protecting his people. And so he rebukes the nobles and the rulers. Here's what he says. Each of you is exacting usury from his brother. Each of you. Usury. What's usury? Your interest. Yeah. You're taking money from your own people that is not just a payback. You're taking interest. You're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. So he says, I rebuked them. And then what does he do next? He says, I called a great assembly against them. And here's what I said to them. So he didn't just go to them individually. He all of a sudden kind of pulled a Matthew 18 on them, didn't he? He said, okay, we're going to go to you, we're going to talk to you, but that's not enough. We're going to bring everybody else in. We're going to show everybody else. We're going to bring everybody else in. So I called a great assembly. And here's what I said. According to our ability, we have redeemed. The idea of redeemed is what? Payback, buyback, payback. We have redeemed our Jewish brethren who were sold to the nations. Now, the word nations there would imply anybody that's not Jewish. Okay? In Old Testament way of thinking, you were either a Jew or you were considered a Gentile, or you were a Jew or you were everybody else. And that held true even through the New Testament. In Greek, you had really two words that would refer to everybody else. You had the hoilopoi and you had the ta ethnos. You had the hoilopoi, which just means the people, and the ta ethnos just means the nations. And a lot of times, if you were to translate in Greek, you would see that either phrase, sometimes in, say, our translations like King James, New King James, even the American Standard, if I'm not mistaken, would translate it Gentiles, when literally it just means the people, it's everybody else. And so he says here, our own Jewish brethren were sold to the nations, to the Gentiles. Now, indeed, will you even sell your brethren, or should they be sold to us? In other words, should we keep it in-house or should we carry it out of house? That's the question that he's raising. What's their reaction? Nothing to say. Let me ask you a question. What could they have said? If it's true, what could they have said? Nothing. So he says, they said nothing. They were silenced. They found nothing to say. Then Nehemiah says, then I said, what you are doing is not good. Should you not walk in the fear of God because of the reproach of the nations of our enemies? In other words, are you really doing what God would have you to do? Do you fear God enough to do what's right? And what's right is not what's right. I mean, no, what you're doing is not right. Yeah, what's right is right. I messed that up, right? What you're doing, Nehemiah says, is not right. Why? Because they're breaking the old law. Go back and study Leviticus chapter 25 and Deuteronomy 23, and you'll see the laws with regards to what we alluded to a while ago, the laws of lending money. And so he says, do you walk in the fear of God? This was not just, if you will, sort of a law sense, but this was God's law, right? Fear of God. When we think fear of God, what do we think of? You think of that? Go ahead. Yeah, terrifying. You think of that song, the all-seeing eye of God watching you, and you think about, yeah, it's a great song. You think about the eyeball of God watching you and you become afraid. But fear of God, while it encompasses what we think of as fear, but it's really a respect for knowing who God is and what he is and what he can and will do, and that respect leads us to do what he tells us to do. Right? I fear God not from the standpoint of I'm so afraid of him I won't say anything. When I was in third grade, in the mornings, my father would carry my sister and I to school. We didn't have to ride the school bus. We rode it home, but we didn't ride it to school. He would take us to school. He would always take me first and then my sister second. And because there's 4 years difference in us. She's 4 years older than I am. And if she ever comes, you remind her of that. She's 4 years older than I am. but so we were in different school buildings, and I would get carried, I'd get dropped off, and in third grade, we had to go to the gym. And so we went to the gym, and then they'd dismiss us, and we'd go to class. Well, where I had to go to class, you had to walk down a hall, and then you walk down maybe 3 steps down a little hall, and then you turn back to the left, and my room was down that hall. Well, one morning, I was bebopping down the hall because I had been dismissed. And as I turned that little hall blindly to go down where the room was, there stood the principal with his back to me, and all of a sudden he stopped. And me being a small, and I know you find this hard to believe, very meek child, because I was told to fear those people, and I did. I remember stepping on his heel, because he just stopped all of a sudden. He didn't know I was behind him, and I guess I knew he was in front of me. I just didn't know he was going to stop. And I said, sorry. And I kept going. And I remember Mr. Barnett. Son. Because he didn't know who I was. Yes, sir. What do you say to me? You're supposed to say you're sorry. I did. And I think he could tell I was vastly intimidated. You did? Yes, sir. Go to your room. Not a problem. Because my mama was one of these, whatever you get at school, you're going to get at home. You get a whipping at school, you're going to get a whipping at home. That was my mama. And I've already told you stories about how she could find out things before they even happened to me. She'd find them out. She was that good. And so I remember that and thinking I had a fear, but it was a respectful fear. I wasn't really afraid of him. The fear that we have for God is a respect for God. that says, okay, what do you want me to do? Where do you want me to go? How do you want me to be? Nehemiah says, where's the fear of God in all this? Are you really afraid? Are you really fearful enough to respect God and to respect what He has to say? And so verse 10, I also with my brethren, my servants, am lending them money and grain. Please let us stop this usury. Nehemiah identifies. This is a great point of leadership. Nehemiah identifies with his people. I understand what you're going through. Because here's what he says. I also, with my brethren, my servants. He identifies with his audience. But notice what he says. He says, am lending them money and grain. What would that imply about Nehemiah? Generosity? What else? Huh? He's wealthy. He's wealthy enough that he's able to be generous, and he's generous because he's wealthy. Now, I think you'll see that in the last part of this chapter that he's a wealthy man. And that's good. It's good that he has the wealth and he is generous. Because some folks are wealthy and they wouldn't give you a dime, right? So Nehemiah says, I'm willing to help the people. And so then he urges, and it's not one of these just little urges. Notice at the end of this what the translators put in. Now remember, Hebrew and Greek as well, but Hebrew in the Old Testament does not have punctuation marks. But the tense of the verbs that are used sometimes imply intensity. There's an exclamation point. Let's stop this, he says, giving loans with interest. Verse 11, restore now to them even this day their lands, their vineyards, their olive gardens, and their houses. Also 100th of the money and the grain, the new wine and the oil that you've charged them. He says, give it back. Give it back. Historians tell us that interest might have been as high as 12%. Jew to Jew. Persians charged about 20%. Now, how exacting is that, how right is that, I'm not sure. But Nehemiah says, we're going to stop all this. We're going to stop all this. And so, what happens? Well, that's what we'll see. But isn't it interesting that Nehemiah tries to persuade the people? He can't make them from the standpoint of force them. You can't force folks to do anything. One of the things with regards to all of us, and one of the things that's very true with leadership, is that we can be responsible to, but we can't be responsible for. Each individual has to make their own choice. But in being responsible to them, Nehemiah carried the problem to them and said, here's the problem, let's get it fixed. You do. You've got to fix it, and we want you to fix the problem. What a wonderful example that is. Anything anybody like to say? Add. Uh-huh. Okay. Yeah.
I think sometimes people look at us as members of the church and say, y'all can't get along with nothing. I don't want any part of this.
It's true. That is very true. It's an excellent point. We need to be sure that we treat each other royally. All the time. When we agree and disagree. And it doesn't always happen. Sadly, it doesn't always happen. And you've probably experienced it in your years. I have. You would think that the brethren would treat you well. And think is sometimes the operative word that doesn't work. But good point. Anything else? Well, how about their response? So they said, we'll restore it and we'll require nothing from them. We will do as you say. So Nehemiah tries to persuade. They listen. Then I called the priests. Of course, the priests did what? They represented who? God. Yeah. Called the priest, required an oath from them that they would do according to this promise. In other words, Nehemiah says, I've got people he calls the priest in and he says, look, we need to get an oath before God that these folks have said they're going to do this. They're going to make sure that they quit this charging usury to the people. They treat each other the way they should. Isn't that interesting? It's sad, first of all, when you think about it, that you got to call in God and say, we got to make an oath. Because, after all, a man's word is his what? Bond. But at the same point in time, too, this was a common practice amongst Jews. And also the fact that when this was done, this meant we're really going to do it. We've made this oath. We've made it with God. We're going to stick to it. So Nehemiah is holding these people accountable. Yeah. Yeah.
And he said, basically, evidently they were the ones who were doing the interest charging and taking advantage of the people. Kind of like the Psalms said, they want you to send your money to the Lord, but they give you their address.
Yeah. How true. How true. How true. Yeah, you got to get involved. You got to get the people involved that are really the problem. and that might have been the reason that he called them. I mean, it doesn't tell us the reason, but yeah. How true. Anything else?
I take it all and let us involve interest with
Yeah.
In fact,
yeah.
like we are going to involve.
Yeah. 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 Yeah, yeah. I understand his persuasiveness. I read 3 or 4 different commentators on this, and one of them talked about how he was gentle in his persuasion. I thought, no, he wasn't. Yeah, that's a great idea. If I could find my brother that had enough money. Oh, yeah. I keep thinking, y'all pray for my son. He's trying to move to Henderson because that's where his job is, and that will allow Kara, our daughter-in-law, and Gracelyn, our granddaughter, to live in the same community with their other set of grandparents, which will just be good for everybody. And he's putting an offer in on a house this weekend, and I sure hope he gets it because it's a nice house. But so y'all pray for my youngin this weekend. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. I would have supposed so. Right. Yeah. Yeah, and I think it gets back to what Jim was saying. But yes, and should have pointed that out. But I think you're right. Yeah. Anything else? So then he says, I shook out the fold of my garment. The Jews had a sash, the men had a sash, and it became their pocket. Men's pockets are great, right? Men's pockets are not as wonderful as women's pocketbooks. You know why? Women can beat anything to death with a pocketbook because there's 10 million things in it that make it weigh 500 pounds. But a man's pockets are attached to his pants. Well, I just say that just for fun. But they had a sash. The Jews had a sash, and they'd put it was sort of their pocket and they'd put something in it. So now he's basically saying, let's shake out the pockets. Let's shake out, to some say the lap, but the fold of my garment, so may God shake out each man from his house and from his property who does not perform this promise. Even thus may he be shaken out and emptied. This is sort of a way of Jewish condemnation. Let's shake out the pockets. God, shake out each man from his house and from his property who doesn't do what he's supposed to do. So here's part of that oath that he's asking these folks to take before God. Let there be a condemnation. If you don't do what you're supposed to do, let there be a condemnation. And here's the reaction. All the assembly said amen. Praise the Lord. Then the people did according to his promise. So all the people were in agreement. I wonder, don't have an answer for this. You might, and you can say, so does all mean every one of them? Very doubtful, isn't it? Because you can't get everybody to do anything. But vast majority. Of course, then, if it all worked the way it was supposed to, the vast majority would then soon squeeze out the guy that wasn't, right? So it could be sort of a moot point. But at the same point in time, too, the people did according to this promise. And I like that. Here's our response. We're going to do what we're supposed to do. Anything else?
Is Nehemiah saying it starts with him?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah. That's right. Sure. Right. Could very well be. And I'm prone to believe that. I mean, I think that's the way I would lean in all of this. Yes. Is because but here's the intriguing part to me, and this shows to me what happened with regards to when nations came and took nations. What is Nehemiah doing in Nehemiah chapter 1? He's not playing the role of a rich man, is he? He's a cupbearer. He's a butler, if you will. Of course, he's a head butler, but he's the butler for Artaxerxes. But that's what happened when kingdoms took over kingdoms. So what would happen? A rich man, a man in wealth, would be put in a place of servitude. Why? You humble a fellow real quick, right? So that's why I would say, yes, I think you're right in what you're saying. Anything else? Okay. Well, let's look at verse 14. Moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be governor. Now, by the way, here's what happens. Nehemiah gets a sort of promotion. He's appointed to be governor. And governor is interesting because this is a year span of time usually. But he uses this governorship for a little bit different. He says, when I was appointed to be a governor in the land of Judah from the 20th year until the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the governor's provisions. He did not take, it's interesting, he did not take his king's expense account. Well, he didn't have to. He had plenty. But, verse 15, the former governors who were before me laid burdens on the people, took from them bread and wine, besides 40 shekels of silver. Yes, even their servants bore rule over the people, but I did not do so because of the fear of the Lord, or fear of God, excuse me. Indeed, I also continued to work on this wall, and we did not buy any land. All my servants were gathered there for the work. So he's watching out for the people, and he's watching out for the work. And at my table were 150 Jews and rulers, beside those who came to us from the nations round about. Now that which was prepared daily was 1 ox and 6 choice sheep. Also fowl were prepared for me, and once every 10 days an abundance of all kinds of wine. Yet in spite of this, I did not demand the governor's provisions, because the bondage was heavy on this people. So here's where we see the wealth. Nehemiah says, here's what was prepared for me. Here's what I had. And he goes through this list of the ox, the sheep, and the wine. And he says, but I didn't take from the governor, because what my people were going through. But now look at verse 19. Remember me, my God, for good, according to all that I have done for this people. Nehemiah's concern all of a sudden becomes, in verse 19, what? God, I want you to be pleased with what I'm doing. Now, I think that was true all along. I don't think it was just true just now, but it was true all along. Remember me for good. Remember me for the good that I'm doing. Remember me for the good that I'm trying to help with my people. Remember the good that I'm carrying through my life, which is true for God, with God. Anything else?
Don't forget about him saying that he acquired no land, that I was servants working on the wall, and he had someone working on the farm, and everybody was 100% and whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're doing our part all along.
Yeah. Think so. Lessons you can learn. Well, I've got 12 different lessons here. I like the way Nehemiah handled the problem. He analyzed the problem. He took steps from the standpoint of, he analyzed the problem. He went to the people. He made sure that they understood what the problem was, and then did what he could rectify the problem. Isn't it sad what greed does? Greed, even of the Jews, towards their own folks. Greed's a sin. That's something, as you study this chapter, you can give thought to. Verse 15 seems like he was motivated by the love of God and fear for him. We need to be motivated by the same aspects, but fear of God. How about verse 5? Immediate circumstances do not justify actions contrary to God's will. In other words, just because these folks had a need didn't justify the fact that you could go beyond God's law and enact what you want to enact upon the people. Well, I've got some others, but that suffice. What else? Anything else? Chapter 6, next week, Lord willing. Let's pray. Our most kind and gracious and loving Heavenly Father, we're thankful for this day and for the blessing of it. Thankful for the opportunities that we have to study your word, to learn what we can from this wonderful book of Nehemiah. And we ask your richest blessings upon the study that we've had. And as we take this week the things that we've heard and think about them and apply them to our lives, that they'll be a blessing to us and we'll be a blessing to you. We ask that you be with those that are sick and those that are going through difficult times, those that will be mentioned in the announcements in just a few minutes. We ask that you watch over them and bless them. Be with us now. Bless the worship service that we'll enter into in just a few minutes. Watch over us and keep us. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Hope you have a great week.